So this is a follow-on from the video I did last week about the Renters' Rights Bill, which is new legislation we are going to be expecting coming in maybe towards the middle, maybe end of this year. Now, part of the bill introduces the repeal of Section 21. Section 21 no-fault evictions will be kiboshed. There'll be no more. So to replace that, the government have had to put together a few more robust Section 8 elements. Now, I know that things can get changed, so this is a bit of a disclaimer. I've got a list here of the Section 8 grounds, but this is as of today's video date. It might get changed. Always do your own research and make sure that you are happy in the knowledge that the legislation is up to date on the day you go and do your research. Okay, so first of all, if you don't know me, I'm Gannon. I am probably the most prolific, active property investor in the UK. I just share my journey. I share my videos when I'm out in my properties. I share the good stuff, the bad stuff, things that help tenants and things that help landlords. So please do click on that subscribe button before you watch the rest of this video. Okay, I've got my notes, as always, on my iPad. So under the Renters' Rights Bill, the grounds for possession under Section 8 of the Housing Act have been revised. These grounds are now categorised into mandatory and discretionary grounds, each with specific notice periods that landlords must observe before initiating possession proceedings. If you are a landlord and if you are going through eviction proceedings with your tenant, I would always say take independent legal advice. All I'm doing here is giving you the grounds as of today. Right, so the first thing we're going to look at are the mandatory grounds. So the mandatory grounds, if proven, the court must grant possession, provided you've served the correct paperwork. So always check. So ground one, if the property was the landlord's former residence, the landlord had to have previously lived in the property as their main home or intends to occupy it as their main home now. The notice period for that is 4 months. So you must give your tenant 4 months notice if you used to live in the property and you are going to live in the property now. Ground number 2, which is 1A. So that was ground 1. This is ground 1A. Landlords intend to sell the property. The landlord must intend to sell it. You can't just say you're going to sell it and then decide not to sell it, because then you would be breaching those grounds. Notice period, 4 months. Ground 2, mortgage repossession. If the property is subject to a mortgage and it was taken before the tenancy and the lender is entitled to possess the property, then they can do. The notice period given to the tenants in that instance is going to be 2 months. Ground 2ZA, superior lease termination. So this is applicable when a landlord's superior lease is ending within 12 months and the landlord needs possession to comply. Now, this ground is primarily for landlords who are private registered providers of social housing. So it doesn't really affect us. We're not registered social housing providers, but if you are, then this will apply to you. The notice period in that instance is 4 months. The notice periods are quite long now. The next one is ground 2ZB. Possession by the superior landlord allows the superior landlord to seek possession if they became the direct landlord under Section 18 of the Housing Act within the last 6 months. Again, we don't get involved with this element of it and social housing, but the notice period for that is 4 months as well. So the next ground is ground 4, educational institution letting. So if the property is let by an educational institution and it was previously used for student accommodation, then possession is needed for that purpose. Notice period of 2 months. Ground 5, minister of religion. If the property is required for occupation by a minister of religion as a residence from which to perform their duties. What would that be? Like a vicarage, I suppose. Notice period for that is 2 months. Ground 6, redevelopment. If the landlord intends to demolish or reconstruct the property and cannot reasonably carry out the work with the tenant in situ. Now, this is an interesting one. The notice period is 4 months, but effectively what I'm reading from this is that if you want to buy a property and you want to develop it and go inside, rip it out, start again, then you can. So you can give ground 6 redevelopment notice. I'll just read that to you again. If the landlord intends to demolish or reconstruct the property and cannot reasonably do so with the tenant in situ. So that can still mean then you can buy a property, and if you need to redevelop the property and you can't do it with the tenant in situ, there are now grounds for that. The next ground is ground 6A, compliance with enforcement action. So this allows landlords to seek possession if letting the property would breach a banning order. Now, if an improvement notice or prohibition notice has been served under the Housing Act, or if the property is an unlicensed HMO and the local authority has refused to grant a license, then you can evict those tenants, because if you don't, you'll be continuing to breach. The notice period for that is 4 months. Ground 7, the death of a tenant. So if the tenancy has devolved under a will and proceedings for possession are started within 12 months of the passing of the tenant, notice period to the estate would be 2 months. Ground 7A, serious offences or antisocial behaviour. So if the tenant or a person residing in the property or visiting the property has been convicted of a serious offence, a breach of an injunction, or caused a nuisance, notice period 4 weeks, but they need to have been convicted, not just charged. There's a big difference there. Ground 7B, immigration. So if the property is occupied by an adult who is disqualified from renting due to their immigration status, notice period just 2 weeks. That's interesting. Ground 8, persistent rent arrears. So if the tenant has had at least 2 months rent which is unpaid at the time of serving the notice and the court hearing, the notice period is now 4 weeks. I'm going to check that. This is supposed to be the updated version from today. However, rent arrears has gone up to 3 months. I'm sure it has. Let me double check that with you folks, because on the video I did a couple of days ago, the new bill, I'm sure, says that we can now, they've got 3 months, not 2 months. I'm going to double check that. Please, if you know as well, stick it into the comments. Those are the mandatory grounds, which means provided the paperwork has been served correctly, provided you've got lawful reason to serve those grounds, the court must give possession. So let's have a look at the discretionary grounds. So this means that the court may grant possession if deemed reasonable. So this is now discretionary. Ground 9, suitable alternative accommodation. So if there is suitable alternative accommodation available for the tenant to move out into for whatever reason, you can give 2 months notice. It doesn't give me any more information than that at the moment. Ground 10, some rent arrears. So if the tenant has got some unpaid rent at the time of serving the notice and the commencement of court proceedings, 4 weeks notice. There is a caveat there. If they've got some rent arrears and then you go for this ground 10 and then you get to court and they bring those rent arrears up to date, they're no longer in breach of their tenancy agreement, which means there are no grounds. So if you're going to serve notice, I would serve section 8 and section 10 at the same time, and section 11, or ground 11. Sorry, I meant grounds. Which brings me on to ground 11, persistent delay in rent payment. If the tenant has persistently delayed paying their rent, whether or not the rent is currently in arrears, 4 weeks notice. So what we used to do with that, if the tenant was in arrears, would serve ground 8, ground 10 and ground 11 all together. Ground 12, breach of the tenancy agreement. If the tenant has breached any of the terms of the tenancy agreement other than rent payment, then it's 4 weeks notice. So it could be, I don't know, gosh, what would determine a breach? It depends on what's in your AST contract. Ground 13, deterioration of the property condition. If the property's condition has deteriorated due to the tenant's neglect or that of someone residing with the tenant, 2 months notice. Ground 14, nuisance or annoyance. If the tenant or someone living with or visiting them has caused nuisance or annoyance to neighbours or has been convicted of using the property for immoral or illegal purposes, 4 weeks notice. And then finally, ground 14A is domestic violence. All I've got on this at the moment, it says if the property is occupied by a couple and there's evidence of domestic violence. I don't have any more information on that, nor do I have the notice period on that. So that's where we're at the moment with the new grounds for Section 8 at the time of recording this video. If you want to do your own due diligence, you can head over to the Renters' Rights Bill on the .gov website. Have a look for yourself to see what's in there. I will keep you up to date. As I say, a little bit of a caveat with the rent arrears there. I'm quite sure now that notice period, the rent arrear period's gone up to 3 months, not 2. I will check that, but if you know and if you're aware, please do put it in the comments. Right, I'll keep you up to date as always. This is obviously growing. It's going to get closer and closer, and before we know it, it's going to be legislation. So I'm just here bringing you up to date. Don't worry about it, folks. We've got to adapt to survive. And what I would always say is, it's only the bad, unscrupulous landlords that this is going to hurt. Because if you've got your ducks in a row, and if you're a good landlord anyway, you should be doing most of these things anyway under the new Renters' Rights Bill. And if you're doing good due diligence on your tenant, and if they're paying their rent every month, and if they're not causing you a bother, why would you want to evict them anyway? Because let's remember, tenants are our customers. Thank you for watching. Let me know your thoughts, and I'll see you on the next one. Don't forget, click on that subscribe button and do all of that stuff. See you on the next one.